What happens when the king of rock and roll reaches across time itself to sing with the Queen of Hearts? What happens when a voice that died in 1977 is resurrected, not as a ghost, not as a trick, but as a miracle of love, technology, and obsession? In 1994, Céline Dion stood on a stage and sang to a hologram. She cried. The audience cried. The world watched, speechless. But behind that 3-minute moment of television magic lay a story that almost never happened. A story of a little girl in Quebec who fell asleep to Elvis records, of a grieving father who never let go, and of a duet that defied the most absolute border of all, death itself. Long before the world knew her name, before the sold-out arenas and the Las Vegas residencies, before My Heart Will Go On became the anthem of a generation, there was a 12-year-old girl in Charlemagne, Quebec, who would press her ear against a small transistor radio and lose herself completely. Her name was Céline Dion. The Dion household was loud, warm, and overflowing with music. 14 children packed into a modest home, and at the center of it all, a mother who sang and a father who played accordion. Music wasn't a hobby in that house, it was oxygen. But of all the sounds that floated through that Quebec winter air, it was one voice that made Céline go still. A voice so full of gravity and velvet that it seemed to come not from a record player, but from somewhere deeper, from the earth itself. Elvis Presley. She couldn't explain it then, and she would struggle to explain it decades later in interviews. It wasn't merely attraction to a star. It was something more instinctive, more spiritual. Elvis had a quality that transcended language, transcended culture, transcended even time. He could sing a gospel hymn and make an atheist weep. He could deliver a rock lyric and make a grandmother's heart race. For young Céline, still forming her understanding of what a voice could do, Elvis was the answer to a question she hadn't yet learned to ask. What does it sound like when someone sings with their entire soul? She memorized his catalog, not casually, obsessively. She studied the way he held notes at their edges, the way his voice broke just slightly in moments of vulnerability, as if the emotion was almost too large for the sound to contain. She imitated him in her bedroom, laughing at herself, then trying again. Her siblings teased her. Her mother smiled knowingly. Years passed. Céline grew. René Angelil heard her demo tape and wept, then mortgaged his house to fund her career. The rest became music history. By the early 1990s, Céline Dion was one of the most recognizable voices on the planet. She had Grammy Awards. She had international tours. She had everything. But she still had the memory of that transistor radio. She still carried Elvis with her, like a quiet companion who had shaped her before the world shaped her further. When the phone call came in 1993, when the producers of Elvis Presley, the concert, reached out about a collaboration, Céline didn't hesitate for even a moment. Not because it was a career move, not because it was historic, but because it was the chance to finally say thank you to the voice that had taught her everything. She said yes before they finished the sentence. Elvis Aaron Presley died on August 16, 1977, in his Graceland mansion in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 42 years old. The world went into mourning in a way it hadn't since the death of presidents. Flags lowered. Radio stations played nothing but his music. Thousands gathered outside the gates of Graceland, weeping openly in the August heat. But Elvis left something behind that most people don't fully understand. Not just a legacy, but an archive. Thousands of hours of recordings, multiple takes of every studio session, live concert recordings stretching back to the 1950s, voice-only isolation tracks where engineers had separated his vocal from the full band mix, leaving just the pure, unaccompanied sound of Elvis Presley, singing into a microphone. It was in these isolation tracks that the miracle was hidden. By the early 1990s, the technology to work with these recordings had advanced significantly. Priscilla Presley and the estate had been meticulous custodians of the archive, refusing to allow cheap exploitation, but remaining open to projects with genuine artistic integrity. When the concept of pairing Elvis's isolated vocals with a living artist gained momentum, the technical team faced an extraordinary challenge. How do you make a dead man sing with a living woman without it sounding like a gimmick? The answer was patience and perfectionism. The team spent months searching through the archives for the right recording. A vocal performance where Elvis's emotional register would match what a duet partner might bring. They weren't just looking for good singing. They were looking for presence. For a moment where Elvis sounded not like a recording, but like a man in the room, breathing, feeling, responding. They found it in If I Can Dream, a song Elvis had recorded in 1968 for his legendary comeback special, a song born from his genuine anguish following the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, a song he had performed with such raw conviction that even stripped of its orchestra, the vocal alone was enough to make the room feel smaller. Sound engineers then rebuilt the entire musical landscape around it. A new arrangement, written to give Céline space. New orchestration that bridged two eras without betraying either. The technology was cutting edge for the period, but the real artistry was human. The producers had to understand both voices deeply enough to make them belong together. When Céline first heard the isolated Elvis vocal in the studio, she asked the engineers to leave the room. She wanted a moment alone with the voice. Those who worked with her say she sat in the dark for nearly 15 minutes before she was ready to sing. What she was doing in those 15 minutes, she never said. But everyone who knows her story can guess. She was 12 years old again, ear pressed against a radio in Charlemagne, Quebec, listening, learning, loving. The broadcast was part of a Grammy Award special segment in 1994, a celebration of music that dared to do what music has always done at its best, obliterate the boundaries of what is supposed to be possible. The audience that night was filled with the biggest names in the industry. Producers, artists, executives, people who had spent careers developing a sophisticated, almost clinical detachment from spectacle. These were not people who cried at television programs. These were not people who were easily moved. The lights dimmed. On an enormous screen, Elvis appeared. The 1968 comeback special footage, remastered, Elvis in his black leather suit, young and magnetic and devastating. And then Céline walked onto the stage. No elaborate entrance, no pyrotechnics. Just a woman in a simple gown, walking toward a microphone, carrying 40 years of love in her chest. And then they sang. What happened in the room in those 3 minutes is difficult to describe objectively, because objectivity tends to dissolve in the presence of something genuinely transcendent. The technical achievement was remarkable. The blend of the voices was seamless in a way that confounded the ear, that made the rational mind question what it was hearing. But the technical achievement was almost beside the point. What the audience was watching, and what hundreds of millions would watch in the days and weeks that followed, as the performance became one of the most replayed moments in television history, was not a technological trick. It was a conversation, a real one, between a woman who had been formed by a voice she could never meet, and the voice itself, finally answering. Céline held nothing back. Those who know her work understand that she has registers she reserves for only the most important moments, a depth of emotional nakedness that she doesn't offer casually. That night, she went all the way. Her voice met Elvis's with a tenderness that made the duet feel less like a performance and more like a reunion. In the control booth, engineers watched their screens with tears running down their faces. In the audience, Céline's husband and manager, René Angelil, a man who had heard her sing thousands of times, pressed his hands over his mouth. Backstage, a member of the production team said afterward that the silence after the final note lasted longer than any silence he had ever heard in a professional venue. Not the silence of an audience unsure how to react. The silence of an audience that had been struck so completely that applause felt inadequate. Then the room erupted. Priscilla Presley, who had been invited to watch, was seen afterward in the hallway, unable to speak, accepting embraces from strangers. The king and the queen had finally shared a stage. In the weeks that followed the broadcast, something unexpected happened. The conversation about the performance didn't stay in the realm of entertainment journalism. It moved into philosophy departments and music schools and grief counseling sessions and theology classrooms. Because what Elvis and Céline had done together raised a question that humans had been asking in various forms for all of recorded history. Where does a voice go when the person is gone? For grieving people everywhere, people who had lost parents, children, partners, friends, the duet offered something that could not be precisely named but could be deeply felt. It suggested that love, rendered into art with enough sincerity, might have properties that resist the ordinary rules of time and loss, that a voice given fully to music doesn't simply stop, that it waits. Musicologists wrote papers about the technical construction of the arrangement. Ethicists debated the implications of using a deceased artist's work in new contexts without their explicit consent, though the Presley estate's careful stewardship was broadly acknowledged. Technologists saw in the project an early prototype of what digital resurrection might eventually become, for better and worse. But for most people, for the woman who had loved Elvis since childhood in Quebec, for the families of fans who had grown up with his music, for anyone who had ever lost someone whose voice they still heard in quiet moments, the conversation was simpler and more personal. Céline spoke about the experience in an interview years later with characteristic directness. She said that when she listened back to the finished recording, she didn't hear a trick or a technological achievement. She heard him. She heard the man who had shaped her understanding of what singing could be. And in some way she couldn't fully articulate, she felt that he had heard her too, that somewhere in the act of building this bridge across time, something had passed between them that was real. Whether you believe that is possible is perhaps a matter of what you think music is, whether it is merely organized sound, or whether it is, as the greatest artists have always seemed to believe, the closest thing to a permanent record of the human soul. Elvis believed it. He said so many times in many ways. He believed that when he stood in front of a microphone and gave everything he had, he was doing something that mattered beyond the moment, something that would carry beyond him. He was right. Céline Dion proved it on that Grammy stage in 1994. Not with technology, with love, with the radical, stubborn, time-defying act of a woman who had been listening to a voice for 30 years and finally sang back. And the voice, impossibly, beautifully, answered. If I Dare to Dream is not just a song, it is proof that the greatest voices don't die. They wait for the right moment to be heard again. Elvis dared to dream of a world united by music. Céline dared to dream she could reach him. Together, they showed us that art is the only time machine that actually works. Now it's your turn. Tell me in the comments, did you cry watching this duet? Which moment hit you the hardest? And what other impossible duet would you want to see brought to life? Drop your answer below. Share this with someone who still plays Elvis records. they'll understand exactly why this story matters.